My beloved child, something took place last night that nobody expected. The silence that followed felt heavier than any conversation that had happened before. A room filled with relaxed conversation suddenly became quiet when your person stopped speaking. They lowered their eyes and held on to a thought they had been hiding deep inside for a very long time. Their friends noticed it immediately. They noticed the pause. They noticed the hesitation. They noticed the change on their face, as though they had reached the edge of revealing something that could no longer remain hidden. One friend softly asked what was wrong. At first, no reply came. The room became completely quiet. Even the smallest sound seemed distant because something inside your person was caught between fear and honesty. For such a long time, they had carried these emotions in silence. They acted as though nothing affected them. They acted as though everything had stayed the same. They acted as though your name never entered their thoughts when they were alone. But deep inside, they already knew the truth. Then at last, in a voice softer than anyone expected, they admitted they were finally ready to be honest. The moment those words left their lips, everything began to change. Their friends immediately realized that what they were about to hear was something your person had spent a long time denying, something hidden beneath pride, something buried under uncertainty, something postponed again and again because facing it seemed too painful. For a brief moment, it looked like they might stop talking. They leaned back and slowly took a deep breath. The room stayed silent, but this time they kept speaking. Because once the truth starts rising to the surface, it becomes almost impossible to bury it again. They admitted that every distraction had failed. Every attempt to move on somehow brought them back to the same place. Every effort to forget had only made the memories feel stronger. No matter what they tried, one thought always returned. You, your presence, your energy, the empty space you left behind. They explained that they once believed time would slowly erase everything. Instead, time made every feeling even clearer. One of their closest friends looked completely surprised. It was the first time they had spoken with such complete honesty. Before that night, they always appeared confident. They always looked like they had everything under control. Whenever someone asked personal questions, they only gave part of the truth. They stayed away from the deeper reality. But last night, there was nowhere left to hide. No pretending, no excuses, no carefully prepared explanations. Only honesty remained. They admitted that some nights had become much longer than they ever wanted to admit. Thoughts they believed they had left behind kept returning without warning. Words you once shared came back into their memory with unexpected clarity. Moments they believed had disappeared suddenly felt alive once again. Even ordinary situations started reminding them of emotions they once experienced but never fully accepted. Then one friend asked a question that changed the conversation once more. Why now? Why choose this moment to say all of this? The answer came slowly. Because something inside had changed. Because silence no longer felt peaceful. Because pretending had become heavier than speaking honestly. Because they finally understood that some emotions never disappear simply because they are ignored. As the conversation continued, the atmosphere became even more emotional. Your person explained that recently your memory had been appearing during unexpected moments. During peaceful evenings, during ordinary afternoons, during conversations that had absolutely nothing to do with you. It happened without warning. And every single time it happened, it brought the same realization. What they had buried was still alive inside them. One friend tried to interrupt, but your person continued speaking, almost as though they feared their courage would disappear if they stopped. They admitted that while many people seem able to move on with life, they still felt emotionally unfinished. A part of them remained connected to something unresolved, something they had never truly named, something they had never completely understood. Then they said something that left everyone in the room speechless. They admitted they were afraid that by the time they fully accepted what was true, the chance to say it might already be gone. The atmosphere changed immediately. This was no longer only a confession. This was regret slowly revealing itself. Another friend quietly asked if they had ever truly moved on. The answer came without delay. There was no hesitation, no doubt, no uncertainty. The answer was simple. They had never truly moved on. That truth carried more weight than every moment of silence that had come before. They explained that they had hidden behind distance because admitting their attachment felt too risky. They convinced themselves that remaining silent would eventually make those feelings disappear. But instead, the exact opposite happened. As time continued passing, every feeling became even clearer. They remembered conversations they never imagined they would remember. Tiny details that nobody else could possibly understand. Small moments stayed bright in their memory, while countless other memories slowly faded away. It unsettled them because it proved that some connections leave marks that even pride cannot erase. Then they admitted something even more personal. There had been moments when they almost reached out, moments when they nearly ended the silence, moments when they opened a message, stared at the screen for several minutes, and still never pressed send. Their friends exchanged surprised glances. None of them realized those emotions had remained alive for such a long time. Once again, the room became quiet. But the deepest truth had still not been spoken. After another long silence, they finally admitted what had been hidden beneath everything else. They were no longer certain whether hiding their emotions had truly protected them or whether it had cost them something they could never replace. The room became silent once again. Nobody rushed to speak. Everyone understood how heavy those words really were, because once someone reaches that kind of realization, something inside them has already started changing. That was what made last night different from every other night. It was not simply another confession. It was the beginning of genuine honesty after a very long season of avoiding the truth. Then one friend asked one final question. If the opportunity appeared right now, what would you say? Your person looked away for a moment. A gentle smile appeared across their face. A smile filled with both hope and sadness. Then they admitted that the truth should have been spoken much sooner. Silence returned. But this time, the silence felt completely different. Everyone in the room understood that something hidden for a long time had finally been brought into the open. Yet what happened next surprised every single person there. Most people believed the conversation had finally reached its end. Instead, your person continued talking, and now there was no pride left standing in the way. They admitted that for years they had tried to understand their emotions through logic. They searched for answers, they built explanations. They kept telling themselves stories that seemed reasonable, but none of those explanations reflected what was truly happening inside their heart. The truth was both simpler and more difficult than they ever wanted to admit. No matter how far they tried to move ahead, something inside always returned to the same unfinished place, the same unanswered emotion, the same memory, the same connection, the same truth they had spent so much time trying not to face. And for the very first time, they stopped running from it. For the first time, they allowed themselves to simply sit with it. For the first time, they admitted that some emotions remain because they were never fully understood. And perhaps that became the greatest realization of all. Not that those feelings had survived, but that they had survived despite every effort to bury them, despite time, despite distance, despite silence, despite pride. The truth remained unchanged. And now that truth had finally been spoken out loud. Nothing inside that room would ever feel exactly the same again. One friend leaned forward and carefully asked whether those feelings had become even stronger recently. Your person did not answer immediately. They slowly took a deep breath. They paused for another moment. Then they quietly nodded. It was only a small movement, but it carried more meaning than any speech ever could. Everyone sitting in that room immediately understood something important. This was not a passing emotion. This was not a brief moment of loneliness. This was not a temporary feeling that would disappear after a few days. It had grown quietly over time. It had remained alive through every season of silence. It had stayed hidden beneath everyday life, waiting for the moment when the truth could no longer be ignored. One friend gently asked if they believed these feelings would ever fade away. Your person remained quiet for a few seconds before answering. Then they slowly shook their head. They admitted they no longer believed these emotions were something that time could erase. They had waited long enough to see if they would disappear. Instead of becoming weaker, they had become clearer. Instead of fading, they had become easier to recognize. Instead of leaving, they had quietly remained. Another friend asked whether they regretted waiting so long. Your person looked down again before giving an honest reply. They admitted there were many moments they wished they had chosen courage instead of fear. Many moments they wished they had spoken instead of remaining silent. Many opportunities had come and gone while they kept convincing themselves there would always be another chance. Now they understood that silence carries its own consequences. Avoiding the truth does not always protect the heart. Sometimes it only allows regret to grow stronger. They admitted that realization had become impossible to ignore. As the conversation reached its final moments, everyone understood they had witnessed something rare. They had watched someone stop pretending. They had watched someone remove years of emotional walls. They had watched someone finally accept what had always been true inside their heart. The room remained peaceful. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. because there was nothing left that needed to be hidden. The truth had already been spoken, and once truth is spoken with sincerity, it changes not only the person who says it, but also everyone who hears it. Your person quietly looked around the room one last time. Their expression carried relief mixed with uncertainty. They knew they could never return to pretending that nothing remained. The mask had fallen away, the walls had come down, the truth had finally found its voice. Although they did not know what the future would bring, they knew one thing with complete certainty. They could no longer deny what had been living inside them for so long. The feelings were real, the memories were real, the connection was real, and after everything they had tried to do to silence those emotions, they finally understood that some truths are simply meant to be faced rather than hidden. This was never just a passing feeling. It was something that had been quietly building beneath the surface for far longer than anyone had understood, and what they shared next completely changed the direction of the conversation. They admitted there had been many nights when old memories came back without any warning. Details they once believed were gone forever suddenly returned with remarkable clarity. Certain words, familiar expressions, and small moments that seemed completely ordinary at the time. Moments that now felt impossible to erase. Even they were surprised by it. They had never tried to bring those memories back. They had not searched for them. They had not welcomed them. Yet they continued returning on their own. It almost felt as if something deep inside refused to allow that connection to disappear completely. One friend then asked whether they had ever truly convinced themselves that everything was over. A soft smile appeared on your person's face, but it was not a joyful smile. It was the kind of smile people show when they realize they have been pretending for far too long. They admitted that yes, they had told themselves again and again that everything had ended. They convinced themselves enough time had gone by. They convinced themselves the silence meant everything had reached its conclusion. They convinced themselves they had already moved forward. But every time they started believing those thoughts, something small would happen. A familiar idea would suddenly appear. An unexpected memory would return. A feeling they could not explain would slowly rise to the surface. And in that moment, everything they believed was finished suddenly felt unfinished once again. The room grew even quieter. Everyone listened with greater attention. Then came another admission that surprised even the people who knew them best. Your person admitted that recently they had begun noticing something they could no longer overlook. They had started comparing the ordinary moments of their current life to something they had once experienced but never completely understood. They had met different people. They had filled their days with activities. They had kept themselves occupied. Yet none of it carried the same quiet meaning. None of it created the same emotion. None of it reached the same place inside their heart. That realization changed the entire atmosphere, because now this was no longer only about remembering the past. This was about understanding it. This was about finally recognizing something clearly after a very long time. One friend finally asked the question everyone had silently been wondering. They wanted to know if your person was saying those feelings had never actually disappeared. Your person stared straight ahead. There was no hesitation. There was no attempt to avoid the truth. They admitted that although they had stopped talking about those feelings, they had never stopped carrying them. The weight of those words settled across the room. No one spoke for several moments. The honesty was impossible to overlook. Then the conversation moved to an even deeper level. A friend who had stayed quiet until then finally asked why they had hidden these feelings for so many years if they had never really gone away. This time the answer came much more slowly. Every word seemed to come from somewhere deep within. Your person explained that sometimes people hide the truth because saying it out loud makes everything real. And once something becomes real, it asks for attention. It forces people to face what they have delayed. It forces them to face what they misunderstood. It forces them to face what they may have risked losing by remaining silent for too long. The room became silent once again. Everyone could hear the honesty behind every word. This was no longer an ordinary conversation. This was someone speaking from a place they had avoided for a very long time. Then another unexpected confession followed. Your person admitted that there had been several recent moments when they almost reached out. Moments when they nearly ended the silence. Moments when they almost chose complete honesty. But every single time they stopped themselves. Not because they lacked emotion, not because they lacked bravery, but because they were uncertain whether the moment still belonged to them. That uncertainty had kept them standing still. They then revealed something even more meaningful. The hardest lesson had been realizing that feelings do not always disappear simply because they become quiet. Sometimes emotions stop asking for attention. Sometimes they move quietly into the background. Sometimes they stay silent for months or even years, but silence does not always mean something is gone. Some feelings simply wait, patiently, quietly, until one unexpected evening arrives, an evening when hiding them becomes more difficult than admitting them. And for your person, last night became that evening. One friend then asked whether they believed those feelings still mattered. The answer came immediately. Your person admitted that if those feelings no longer mattered, they would not still be thinking about the words they never said. They would not still be wondering about the opportunities they missed. They would not still be carrying questions that had never been answered. That statement remained in the room long after it was spoken, because regret does not continue without a reason. It does not keep speaking unless something truly valuable is still connected to it. Then their voice changed once again. For the first time that night, they revealed something they had never told anyone before, not even their closest friends. They admitted there had been moments when they imagined what might happen if honesty arrived too late. Moments when they wondered whether silence had already changed more than they realized. Moments when they questioned whether missing the right opportunity had become the one mistake they might never completely repair. Their friends listened with complete attention. What they saw now was no longer hesitation. What they saw was genuine honesty. There were no walls left, no carefully prepared explanations, no effort to appear untouched. Only truth. And what happened next surprised even your person. One friend gently asked what they would do if another chance still existed. The question sounded simple, but its effect was immediate. Your person looked toward the floor. They took a slow breath. For several long seconds they remained silent. Then they admitted that if another opportunity still existed, they would no longer waste time pretending there was nothing left to say. That answer changed everything, because suddenly this was no longer only about the past. It was about possibility. It was about what might still happen. Everyone sitting in that room understood the difference. Last night was not the ending of hidden emotions. It was the beginning of finally accepting them. No one expected the conversation to become any deeper. Yet after giving that answer, your person stopped holding anything back. The atmosphere shifted once again when a friend asked what had finally pushed them to admit everything after hiding it for such a long time. Your person remained silent, not because they did not have an answer, but because the answer carried more emotion than they wanted anyone to witness. Their eyes lowered, their hands stayed completely still. Eventually, they admitted that something had happened earlier that day. It was an incredibly small moment, so small that nobody else would have noticed it. Yet for them, it was impossible to ignore. It was not a conversation. It was not a message. It was not a dramatic event. It was simply an unexpected reminder. A reminder that appeared without warning. A reminder that instantly brought back everything they believed had become quiet. That realization deeply shook them, because it arrived during a moment when they had been convincing themselves they had already moved on. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. How could someone honestly say they were finished with a feeling, if one ordinary reminder could still completely change their mood? How could they call it the past, if it still held so much influence? That question stayed with them, and the longer they thought about it, the harder it became to keep pretending. Their friends listened more carefully than ever before. Every sentence now sounded less like remembering and more like understanding that was unfolding in real time. Then someone quietly asked whether they had been carrying these feelings every single day. Your person thought carefully before answering. They admitted it was not every day. There were many days when life became busy. There were days when work, daily responsibilities, and constant distractions filled their attention. There were days when they hardly thought about it at all. Yet the feeling returned often enough that they could no longer call it a coincidence. It came back often enough that they could no longer ignore it. It returned often enough that they finally had to face what they had been trying to avoid. Deep inside, something had never fully let go, and for the first time, they stopped trying to deny it. That answer made the entire room fall completely silent. Everyone understood there was a clear difference between remembering someone every now and then and realizing that person still entered your thoughts much more often than expected. The silence carried a new kind of meaning. It was no longer filled with uncertainty, it was filled with understanding. Then your person admitted something that left even their closest friends speechless. They confessed that there had been moments when they laughed with other people, while part of their mind quietly drifted somewhere else. There were moments when conversations continued around them, but inside they found themselves making quiet comparisons. They compared emotions, they compared energy, they compared connections. They compared what felt real and what felt incomplete. The more attention they gave those comparisons, the harder they became to ignore. Every comparison eventually led back to the same place, a place they had never completely closed, a place they had never truly left behind. Then they revealed something even more personal. There had been nights when they almost became completely honest with themselves, nights when the truth rested right in front of them, nights when they nearly accepted what they had already known. But every time they stopped themselves, because true honesty would have forced them to admit that distance had never fully changed what still lived inside them. That realization felt heavier than anything they had admitted before. One friend finally asked whether they were afraid of what all of this really meant. This time the answer came without delay. Your person admitted that they were afraid, not because of the feelings themselves, but because accepting those feelings completely meant they could no longer keep pretending. The moment they accepted the truth, every excuse would disappear, every explanation would lose its meaning, every wall they had carefully built would slowly begin to collapse. That answer carried incredible weight. Everyone sitting in the room understood exactly what they meant. Pretending had become protection, distance had become an excuse, silence had become a shield. For a long time those things helped them avoid difficult questions, but last night all three slowly began to fall apart. Then another unexpected realization appeared. Your person admitted that they had often listened to people speak confidently about moving forward. They listened to advice about forgetting the past. They listened to advice about letting go. They listened to advice about focusing only on the future. Some of those words sounded reasonable, some of them truly made sense, but none of them reached the part of their heart that still carried unanswered emotions. Advice can help guide decisions. Advice can influence actions. But advice cannot erase something that still feels unfinished inside. That truth remained exactly where it had always been. A friend leaned forward and asked one final question. They wanted to know what would be the hardest thing to admit if complete honesty filled the room at that very moment. This time there was no hesitation at all. Your person admitted that the hardest truth was realizing how much time had been spent pretending to be unaffected. For so long they waited for clarity to arrive on its own. They hoped understanding would simply appear one day. They believed the answers would come naturally. They hoped time would solve everything for them. But clarity never arrived quietly. It arrived that night. It arrived in that room. It arrived through words they had avoided saying for far too long. That realization changed everything. Then something unexpected happened. A friend who had remained mostly silent throughout the conversation finally looked directly at your person. Their observation was simple. They gently suggested that perhaps the feeling had been real for much longer than your person had ever allowed themselves to admit. No one interrupted. No one argued. The words settled quietly across the room. Suddenly the truth seemed visible to everyone. And for the first time your person made no attempt to deny it. Instead they took a slow breath and admitted something even more meaningful. Part of them may have known the truth long before that evening. The real struggle had never been discovering it. The real struggle was hearing themselves finally speak it out loud. That confession carried tremendous weight because there is something deeply powerful about hearing your own voice speak a truth you have spent so long avoiding. Once those words are spoken, they can no longer be ignored. Once they are spoken, everything begins to change. The night was coming to an end. Yet one final moment revealed more than everything that had come before. Before the conversation ended, your person slowly looked around the room and quietly admitted something. If life ever offered another completely honest moment, they would choose different words than the ones they had chosen in the past. Not delayed words, not guarded words, not carefully chosen words meant to hide emotion. Different words, honest words, words spoken without fear. Everyone understood exactly what that meant. This was no longer simple reflection. This was the beginning of genuine change. Because sometimes the strongest confession is not loud. Sometimes it arrives softly. Sometimes it appears after months or even years of silence. And when it finally arrives, it carries more power than anyone could have imagined. That night became one of those unforgettable moments. Yet even then the conversation was not finished. After everything your person had already revealed, everyone believed the deepest truth had already been spoken. They were mistaken. The room became quiet once again, but this silence felt different. It was not uncomfortable. It was not uncertain. It felt as though one last truth was still waiting beneath the surface. Your person remained seated quietly. It seemed as though they were listening to thoughts they had avoided for months, perhaps even years. When they finally looked up again, something in their expression had changed. The resistance had disappeared. The struggle had faded away. It was the expression of someone who had finally stopped fighting what they already knew. One friend noticed it immediately. They gently asked whether there was still something left unsaid. The question remained hanging in the air. Your person did not answer right away. This time, the answer felt more important than everything that had been said before. After a long pause, they admitted something that completely changed the meaning of the entire night. The hardest part was not discovering what they truly felt.